The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the Broken Arrow Ranch as Samuel Morrison sat in his father's old rocking chair, watching dust devils dance across the parched earth. At 43, Samuel had the weathered hands and sun-beaten face of a man who had worked the land his entire life, but his green eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had helped him survive 3 droughts, 2 cattle diseases, and more loneliness than any man should have to bear. The ranch had been in the Morrison family for 4 generations, carved out of the harsh Texas landscape by his great-grandfather with nothing but determination and a stubborn refusal to quit when times got tough. Now 5,000 acres of prime grazing land stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with mesquite trees and crossed by a creek that ran year-round, making it one of the most valuable properties in Caldwell County. Samuel lived alone on the ranch, had done so for the past 8 years since his wife Mary died in childbirth, along with their son. The tragedy had broken something inside him, and he'd withdrawn from the community that had once embraced him. He worked his land with the help of 3 Mexican cowboys who respected his need for solitude, speaking only when necessary about cattle movements and fence repairs. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his morning coffee ritual. Samuel counted 5 riders moving purposefully toward his ranch house, with the confident bearing of men who were used to getting their way. At the head of the group rode Cornelius Blackwood, a man whose expensive suit and gold watch chain looked absurdly out of place in the rugged landscape. Blackwood was the president of Caldwell First National Bank, a position he'd used to gradually acquire influence over most of the county's business dealings. He was a man of average height, but possessed an oversized sense of importance, his round face perpetually flushed with the ruddy complexion of someone who drank expensive whiskey and ate rich food while others struggled to make ends. Meet behind Blackwood rode 4 men who made no pretense of being anything other than hired guns. Samuel recognized their type immediately: drifters who sold their skills with a revolver to the highest bidder, men with cold eyes and quick hands who measured their worth in the fear they inspired in others. "Morrison," called Blackwood, as he reined in his horse at the bottom of the porch steps. "We need to have a conversation." Samuel didn't move from his rocking chair, but his right hand casually moved closer to the Colt .45 that hung on a gun belt draped over the chair's arm. "I wasn't aware we had any business to discuss, Blackwood." The banker dismounted, with the careful movements of a man unaccustomed to physical activity, brushing dust from his coat with exaggerated motions. "Oh, but we do. Very urgent business, as it turns out." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document, holding it up like a trophy. "This, my friend, is a promissory note signed by your late father, God rest his soul. It seems he borrowed a considerable sum from my bank 15 years ago, using this ranch as collateral." Samuel felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. His father, Thomas Morrison, had died 3 years earlier, taking with him the details of the ranch's financial history. Samuel had assumed the property was free and clear, inherited without encumbrance. "I never saw any such document," Samuel said carefully, his mind racing through the implications. "Well, that's understandable," Blackwood replied with false sympathy. "Your father was a proud man. Probably didn't want to burden you with the knowledge that he'd mortgaged the family legacy to keep it running during the drought of '78. One of the gunmen, a lean man with a scarred face and dead eyes, shifted in his saddle and rested his hand on his pistol grip. Samuel noticed the movement but kept his expression neutral. "The original loan was for $10,000, Blackwood continued, unfolding the document. "With 15 years of accumulated interest at 12% annually, compounded, the total debt now stands at $54,000. The amount hit Samuel like a physical blow. It was more money than the ranch could generate in 5 good years, let alone the 3 difficult ones since his father's death. Even if he sold every head of cattle, every horse, and every piece of equipment, he wouldn't come close to raising such a sum." "That's a substantial amount," Samuel said. fighting to keep his voice steady. "I'd need time to review the terms, consult with a lawyer." Blackwood's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm afraid time is a luxury we don't have. The note is due for payment today, Morrison. Full payment, or I'll be forced to foreclose on the property immediately." "Today?" Samuel's voice sharpened. "How convenient that you choose to present this claim right after cattle prices hit their lowest point in a decade." "Business is business," Blackwood shrugged. "Market conditions are unfortunate, but they don't change legal obligations." Samuel stood slowly, his hand now resting openly on his gun belt. The 4 hired men tensed, but none drew their weapons yet. They were professionals waiting for a clear signal from their employer. "I find it interesting," Samuel said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "that this supposed debt would surface just weeks after the railroad announced their plans to run a line straight through this valley. Land that was worth $50 an acre last year is suddenly worth 5 times that amount." Blackwood's face flushed deeper, but his voice remained controlled. "I don't appreciate your insinuations, Morrison. This is a legitimate business transaction, properly documented and legally binding. Then you won't mind if I take a few days to verify the authenticity of your document," Samuel replied. "I'm sure Judge Harrison would be happy to review the paperwork." The banker's expression hardened. "Judge Harrison suffered a stroke last week. He's in no condition to review anything. The new circuit judge won't be through Caldwell for another month." Samuel felt the walls closing in around him. Without Judge Harrison, who had been a friend of the Morrison family for decades, he would have no ally in the legal system. Blackwood had clearly timed this confrontation perfectly. "So here's how this is going to work," Blackwood said, his voice taking on the tone of a man who held all the cards. "You sign over the deed to this property to settle the debt, and I'll allow you to take your personal belongings and your horses. You have 1 hour to gather what you need and clear out, and if I refuse—" Blackwood gestured toward his hired guns. "These gentlemen are here to ensure the legal process proceeds smoothly. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings." Samuel looked at each of the 4 gunmen in turn, measuring their stance, their readiness, their commitment to their employer's cause. He'd been in gunfights before, during his younger days when the ranch was still being established and rustlers were a constant threat. But 4 professional killers were odds that even his considerable skill couldn't overcome. "You're making a mistake, Blackwood," Samuel said quietly. "This ranch means everything to me. It's all I have left of my family, my history. Taking it from me won't be as easy as you think." "Sentiment doesn't pay debts," Blackwood replied coldly. "And threats don't change the law. You have 59 minutes remaining." As the banker and his men settled in to wait, Samuel's mind raced through his options. He could try to fight, but that would likely end with his death and Blackwood taking the ranch anyway. He could run, but abandoning the land his family had built would be a betrayal of everything his ancestors had sacrificed for. Then he remembered something. A conversation with his father years ago about hiding important documents where they couldn't be found by thieves or destroyed by fire. His father had been a cautious man, suspicious of banks and lawyers, preferring to keep his most valuable papers in a place known only to family, the old well behind the ranch. House stood a stone well that had been the original water source when his great-grandfather first settled the land. It had been sealed and abandoned 20 years ago when they dug a newer, deeper well closer to the house. But Samuel suddenly remembered his father mentioning that the old well had a secret compartment built into its stone lining, a hiding place for documents too important to risk losing. "I need to gather my things from the house," Samuel said to Blackwood. "Fine, but don't try anything foolish. My men will be watching." Samuel walked into the ranch house, his mind focused on the possibility that his father might have left behind some document that could counter Blackwood's claim. The house felt empty and cold, filled with memories of better times, when Mary's laughter had echoed through the rooms, and hopes for the future had seemed bright and attainable. He moved through the house methodically, packing a few essential items while his thoughts raced. If there was something hidden in the old well, He'd need to find a way to retrieve it without alerting Blackwood's men. The well was visible from the house, but there might be a moment when their attention was elsewhere. Through the window, he watched Blackwood pacing impatiently while his gunmen maintained their positions. The banker kept checking his pocket watch, clearly eager to conclude his business and claim his prize. Samuel realized that this had probably been planned for months, waiting for the perfect moment when he would be most vulnerable and isolated. As he packed his father's old Bible and a few photographs, Samuel's resolve hardened. The Morrison family had not built this ranch over 4 generations just to see it stolen by a corrupt banker and his hired killers. If there was any way to fight back, any legal document or family secret that could turn the tables, he would find it. The old well-held secrets that his father had taken to the grave, and Samuel was determined to uncover them before his hour was up. Because sometimes the last hope lies buried in the most unexpected places, waiting for the right moment to change everything. Outside, Blackwood's voice drifted through the window. 45 minutes, Morrison. Time's running out. But Samuel Morrison had spent his entire life learning that in the harsh landscape of Texas, survival often came down to the hidden resources you kept in reserve for when everything else failed. And he wasn't ready to surrender his family's legacy without exploring every possibility. No matter how desperate, the old well waited in the gathering morning heat, holding secrets that might determine whether the Broken Arrow Ranch would remain in Morrison hands or fall to the schemes of men who measured everything in dollars and threats. Samuel finished packing his few essential belongings, all the while his mind working on the problem of reaching the old well without alerting Blackwood's men. Through the kitchen window, he could see the stone structure about 50 yards behind the house, partially concealed by a stand of mesquite trees that had grown up around it over the years. The gunmen were positioned strategically around the property. 2 remained mounted near Blackwood at the front of the house, while the other 2 had spread out to watch the sides of the building. But Samuel noticed that none of them had a clear view of the back of the property where the old well stood. 30 minutes, Morrison. Blackwood's voice carried an edge of impatience and anticipation. Samuel made his decision. He would have to create a distraction to draw attention away from the rear of the house. Moving to the kitchen, he lit the stove and placed a large pot of water on the burner, then opened the damper on the chimney fully. Within minutes, thick smoke began billowing from the chimney in irregular puffs that would suggest a problem with the flue. Sure enough, one of the side guards called out, "Boss! Something's wrong with the chimney. Might be a fire starting." "Check it out," Blackwood ordered. "We don't need the house burning down before we take possession." Samuel watched through the window as both side guards moved toward the front to investigate the smoke. This gave him a narrow window of opportunity. He slipped out the back door, moving low and fast toward the old well. The stone structure was about 4 feet in diameter, topped with a wooden cover that had warped and weathered over the years. Samuel lifted the heavy cover and peered down into the darkness below. The well was dry, its bottom lost in shadow about 20 feet down. His father had mentioned the secret compartment was built into the stone lining, but he hadn't specified where. Samuel ran his hands along the upper stones, feeling for any that might be loose or different from the others. Nothing. He leaned further into the well, reaching deeper. "What are you doing out there, Morrison?" Samuel's blood turned to ice. One of the gunmen had circled around the back of the house and spotted him. The man was already drawing his weapon, his scarred face twisted in suspicion. "Just getting some water for the road," Samuel replied, trying to keep his voice casual while his mind raced for options. "That well's been dry for 20 years, the gunman sneered. "Nice try. Step away from it, nice and slow." Samuel had no choice but to comply, but as he straightened up, his hand brushed against a stone that felt different from the others. It was slightly recessed and seemed to give a little under pressure. He made a mental note of its location, about 3 feet down on the north side of the well. Found him nosing around the old well. "Boss!" the gunman called out as he marched Samuel back toward the front of the house. Blackwood's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What were you looking for, Morrison? Hidden gold?" Secret passages. This isn't a dime novel. Just saying goodbye to family history, Samuel replied. That well was dug by my great-grandfather with his own hands. How touching, Blackwood said sarcastically. Your time's up anyway. Sign the deed transfer, or we'll remove you by force. The banker produced another document from his jacket. This one a deed transfer that would sign over the entire ranch in exchange for forgiveness of the supposed debt. The paper looked official enough, with legal language and spaces for signatures. Samuel stared at the document, knowing that signing it would end 4 generations of Morrison ownership of the land. But he also knew that the 4 guns trained on him left little room for negotiation. I need a pen, he said finally. Blackwood smiled triumphantly and handed him a gold fountain pen. I knew you'd see reason. Sign at the bottom and we can conclude our business. Samuel took the pen, but didn't immediately move toward the paper. Instead, he looked up at the banker with steady eyes. Before I sign away my family's legacy, I think I have the right to hear exactly what debt my father supposedly owed. I already explained that, Blackwood said impatiently. $10,000, borrowed 15 years ago. For what purpose? Blackwood waved dismissively. Does it matter? Probably to buy cattle or seed or whatever ranchers spend money on. It matters to me, Samuel insisted. If I'm going to lose everything my family built, I want to know why my father would have risked it all. The banker sighed heavily, as if dealing with a difficult child. Fine. According to my records, the loan was taken out in March of 1878 to purchase a prize breeding bull from a ranch in Kansas. Your father claimed the animal would improve his herd quality significantly. Samuel nodded slowly, but inside, his suspicions were confirmed. His father had indeed bought a breeding bull in 1878, but Samuel remembered the transaction clearly because he'd been involved in selecting the animal. They had paid cash for the bull, money that had been saved for 3 years, specifically for that purchase, moreover. March of 1878 had been during the drought Blackwood mentioned, and Samuel remembered his father's exact words about avoiding debt during difficult times. A man who borrows money during a drought is like a man who takes off his coat in a blizzard. It might feel good for a moment, but it'll kill you in the end. Thomas Morrison would never have borrowed money to buy anything during that drought year. That's interesting, Samuel said carefully, because I remember that bull, big red Angus named Thunder. Cost us $800 cash on the barrel. Blackwood's face flushed slightly. Well, perhaps there were additional expenses. Transportation, feed, veterinary costs, perhaps, Samuel agreed. But surely those costs wouldn't have required a $10,000 loan. Look, Morrison, I don't have time to debate ancient history, Blackwood snapped. The debt is legal and documented. Sign the paper or face the consequences. Samuel pretended to consider the document more carefully, but his real attention was on the positioning of the 4 gunmen. They had relaxed slightly, confident that their job was nearly finished. This might be his only chance to make a move toward the old well. There's something else I need to check first, Samuel said suddenly. My father left some personal papers that might relate to this debt. They're in the old well, where he kept important documents safe from fire. Nice try, Blackwood laughed. You already played that game. My man caught you nosing around back there. He caught me trying to remember exactly where my father hid things, Samuel corrected. I know there's a document back there that might shed light on this whole situation. One of the gunmen, the one with the scarred face, spoke up. Boss, maybe we should let him look. If there's something back there that proves the debt, it'll make our legal position stronger. Blackwood considered this. 5 minutes, he decided. But we all go together and no tricks. The group moved toward the old well, with Samuel leading the way and the 4 gunmen arranged around him with their weapons drawn. Blackwood brought up the rear, clutching his documents and muttering about wasted time. At the well, Samuel again lifted the wooden cover. The papers are in a hidden compartment about 3 feet down, he explained. I'll have to lean pretty far in to reach it. Do it, Blackwood ordered. But remember, any sudden moves, and my men will put more holes in you than Swiss cheese. Samuel leaned into the well. feeling along the stone lining until he found the slightly recessed stone he'd noticed earlier. He pressed against it, and to his amazement it slid inward with a grinding sound. Behind it was a small cavity, lined with oiled leather to protect its contents from moisture. His fingers closed around a packet of papers, wrapped in more oiled leather, and tied with a leather cord. His heart pounded as he carefully extracted the packet and lifted it out of the well. "What did you find?" Blackwood demanded, his voice tight with suspicion. Samuel untied the leather cord and unfolded the outer wrapping. Inside were several documents in his father's careful handwriting, along with some official-looking papers with legal seals. The top document was labeled in his father's hand. For Samuel Morrison, to be read only if the ranch is threatened by thieves or swindlers. Samuel's pulse quickened as he realized his father had anticipated this exact situation. "Well?" Blackwood pressed. "What does it say?" Samuel began reading aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I, Thomas Morrison, being of sound mind and fearing that unscrupulous men might someday attempt to steal the Broken Arrow Ranch through fraudulent debt claims, do hereby set down the truth of all financial dealings concerning this property." Blackwood's face had gone pale. "That proves nothing. Old men write all sorts of nonsense in their final years." But Samuel continued reading. "In particular, I want it known that I never borrowed money from Caldwell First National Bank or any other financial institution. Any document claiming otherwise is a forgery, and I have taken steps to prove this." Samuel looked up at the banker, whose face was now ashen. "There's more, Blackwood. Do you want to hear it?" "This is ridiculous," the banker blustered. "A man can write anything he wants on a piece of paper. It doesn't make it legally binding." Samuel smiled grimly and continued reading. "To prove my statements, I have obtained sworn affidavits from 3 witnesses to my financial dealings, including Bank President Cornelius Blackwood's predecessor, Jonathan Hartwell, who will testify that no loans were ever made to the Morrison family." The silence that followed was broken only by the whisper of wind through the mesquite trees. Samuel could see the fear growing in Blackwood's eyes as he realized that his carefully constructed scheme was unraveling. But there was more in the packet, and Samuel sensed that his father had been even more thorough than he'd initially appeared. "It gets better," Samuel announced, unfolding another document. "This appears to be a confession." Blackwood made a strangled sound, but Samuel pressed on, reading aloud the words that would change everything. "Moreover, I have discovered evidence that Cornelius Blackwood has been systematically forging loan documents to steal property throughout Caldwell County. I've documented 3 other cases where he has used identical schemes, and I have hidden copies of the evidence where honest men can find them." The 4 gunmen exchanged uncertain glances. They had been hired to help foreclose on a legitimate debt, but forgery and land fraud were crimes that could bring federal marshals and serious prison time. Samuel looked directly at Blackwood, whose face was now gray with fear and rage. "Should I continue reading, or would you like to discuss a new arrangement?" The banker's hand moved toward his jacket, but Samuel was ready for him. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Blackwood. These documents include detailed instructions on where to find evidence of your other fraudulent schemes. If something happens to me, my ranch hands have instructions to deliver copies to the territorial marshal in Austin." Blackwood's hand froze. His carefully constructed empire of corruption was collapsing around him, brought down by a dead man's foresight and a son's determination to protect his family's legacy. The 4 gunmen were now looking at their employer with open suspicion, realizing they had been hired to participate in what amounted to organized theft. Samuel sensed the shift in the balance of power and pressed his advantage. "Here's my new offer, Blackwood. You and your men mount up and ride out of here right now. You destroy any forged documents related to my ranch, and you don't come back, ever." "And if I refuse?" Blackwood asked, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. Samuel smiled coldly. "Then I read the rest of these documents aloud, including the parts about where you've hidden the money you've stolen from other families. I'm betting these gentlemen would be very interested in learning about assets they might be able to claim as back wages." The scarred gunman stepped forward, his hand still on his weapon, but his attention now focused on Blackwood rather than Samuel. "Boss, is what he's saying true? Have you been running some kind of land swindle?" Blackwood's silence was answer enough. The tension in the air was electric as loyalties shifted and the true nature of the situation became clear to everyone present. Samuel held the hidden will in his father's confession like a royal flush in a high-stakes poker game, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether the Broken Arrow Ranch remained in Morrison hands or fell to the schemes of corrupt men. But Thomas Morrison had been more clever than anyone had realized, and his final gift to his son was about to turn the tables on those who thought they could steal 4 generations of hard work and family. Pride, subscribe to our channel to see how this dramatic confrontation concludes. Will Samuel's father's hidden documents be enough to save the ranch, or do Blackwood and his gunmen have one final card to play? Don't miss the thrilling conclusion of this tale of justice, family legacy, and the power of preparation. The morning air seemed to crackle with tension as the full implications of Thomas Morrison's hidden documents became clear to everyone standing around the old well. Samuel could see the calculation going on in the minds of the 4 gunmen as they reassessed their employer and their situation. Men who lived by violence were pragmatic by nature, and their loyalty extended only as far as their paychecks. The scarred gunman, who seemed to be their leader, took another step toward Blackwood. "Boss, I need to hear you say it plain. Are these loan papers real, or have you been running a con game?" Blackwood's face cycled through several colors as he struggled to maintain control of a situation that was slipping away from him with each passing second. "Listen, boys, this doesn't change anything. Even if there are irregularities in the paperwork, this ranch is still valuable property. We can work out new arrangements." "New arrangements?" Samuel laughed, holding up another document from his father's cache. "Let me read you what my father wrote about those new arrangements. This is a letter addressed to the territorial marshal, dated just 2 months before my father died." Samuel cleared his throat and began reading in a clear, strong voice. "Marshal Reynolds, by the time you read this letter, I will likely be dead, and Cornelius Blackwood will probably be attempting to steal my ranch using forged loan documents. But I have spent the last 5 years documenting his criminal enterprise, and I have proof that he has defrauded at least 7 families out of their property." Blackwood made a desperate lunge toward Samuel, trying to grab the papers, but the scarred gunman's pistol was suddenly pointed at the banker's chest. "Hold on there." "Boss," the gunman said coldly, "I want to hear the rest of this, especially the part about where you might have stashed the money from 7 ranches. Samuel continued reading. "Blackwood's method is always the same. He waits until a property owner dies, then produces forged loan documents, claiming the deceased owed massive debts to his bank. The forgeries are good enough to fool most people, but they all have the same flaw. Blackwood uses the same type of ink and paper for all of them, purchased in bulk from a supplier in Dallas." The banker's face went from gray to green as his worst fears were confirmed. Thomas Morrison had been far more observant and careful than Blackwood had ever suspected. "Moreover," Samuel read on, "I have discovered that Blackwood keeps detailed records of his illegal activities in a safe hidden behind a false wall in his bank office. The combination to this safe is his mother's birthday, 1823-07. The 4 gunmen exchanged meaningful glances. Information like that was worth more than whatever Blackwood was paying them for this job. A bank safe full of stolen money and incriminating documents represented a much more lucrative opportunity than simple muscle work." "Is that true, Blackwood?" demanded another of the gunmen, a younger man with cold blue eyes. "You got a safe full of cash and evidence sitting in your bank?" "This is preposterous," Blackwood spluttered. "You can't believe the ravings of a dead man. Morrison was probably senile, making up stories." Samuel folded the letter carefully and pulled out another document. Well, let's see if my father was making up stories. This appears to be a bank statement from First National Bank of Dallas, showing purchases of stationery and ink by Cornelius Blackwood. Dated 3 years ago, about the same time the Watson family lost their ranch to a mysterious debt claim. He held up the statement where everyone could see the itemized purchases, special paper stock, specific ink types and wax for making seals. It was exactly the kind of evidence that would prove forgery in any court of law. The scarred gunman holstered his weapon and stepped back from Blackwood. "Boys, I think we've been working for the wrong side of this deal." "Now wait just a minute," Blackwood said desperately. "We can work this out. There's enough money in this for everyone if we just stick to the original plan." "What original plan?" Samuel asked, pulling out yet another document. "The one where you steal my ranch, sell it to the railroad for 10 times what it's worth, and then disappear with enough money to live like a king in Mexico?" Blackwood's mouth fell open. Thomas Morrison's intelligence network had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Samuel continued. "My father even found out about your arrangement with the railroad surveyor. They've already agreed to pay $250,000 for the mineral rights alone, haven't they, Blackwood?" The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone present suddenly understood the true scope of Blackwood's scheme. This wasn't just about foreclosing on a ranch. It was about stealing a fortune in mineral rights that could make a man rich beyond imagination. The scarred gunman slowly smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. $250,000. That's a lot more than the $50 a day you're paying each of us. Now see here, Blackwood began, but his voice had lost all authority. He was no longer the puppet master pulling strings, but rather a man whose puppets had turned against him. Samuel sensed that the moment had come to press his final advantage. He pulled out the last document from his father's cache, a thick legal paper with an official seal. "This is the most interesting document of all," he announced. "It's a deed to mineral rights, filed with the county clerk 3 months before my father died. It seems he suspected what you were up to, Blackwood, and he made sure that even if you somehow got the ranch, you'd never get the thing you really wanted." He held up the deed so everyone could see the official seal and signatures. "The mineral rights to the Broken Arrow Ranch are now held in trust for my future children, managed by a law firm in Austin. Even I can't sell them without approval from 3 independent trustees." Blackwood staggered as if he'd been physically struck. His entire scheme had been built around acquiring those mineral rights, and Thomas Morrison had checkmated him from beyond the grave. The 4 gunmen were now looking at their employer with open hostility. They had signed on to help with what they thought was a legitimate business transaction. But now they realized they'd been drawn into a criminal conspiracy that could see them all hanged if it went wrong. "Blackwood," said the scarred gunman in a voice like gravel, "I think you owe us some explanations, and maybe some compensation for being lied to." The banker backed away from his former employees, his face pale with the realization that he was now surrounded by armed men who had every reason to be angry with him. Samuel stepped forward, still holding his father's documents. "Gentlemen, I have a proposition for you. These papers include detailed information about where Blackwood has hidden money stolen from other families. There's probably enough there to make you all wealthy men. All I want is for you to ensure that Blackwood faces justice for his crimes." "What kind of justice?" asked the blue-eyed gunman. "The legal kind," Samuel replied firmly. "My father left instructions for contacting a federal marshal who's been investigating land fraud in this territory. Blackwood, delivered to the proper authorities, along with evidence of his crimes, would be worth more to you in reward money than anything he could pay you for illegal work." The scarred gunman nodded slowly. "Makes sense. Dead men don't pay wages, and Blackwood here is already dead. He just doesn't know it yet." "Now wait," Blackwood pleaded, seeing his situation deteriorating rapidly. "We can make a deal. I have access to bank funds, other properties. We can all profit from this, with stolen money." Samuel shook his head. That's exactly the kind of thinking that got you into this situation in the first place. He turned to address the four gunmen directly. My father's documents include a complete list of Blackwood's crimes, along with evidence of where stolen money is hidden. The federal marshal will pay substantial rewards for this information, and you'll be heroes instead of criminals. The practical appeal of this argument was obvious to men who had spent their lives calculating risks and rewards. Legitimate reward money was far preferable to the uncertain profits of criminal enterprise. "What about you?" the scarred gunman asked Samuel. "You could turn us in for trespassing, threatening behavior." "All I want is to keep my ranch and see justice done," Samuel replied. "You were hired under false pretenses. As far as I'm concerned, you're as much victims of Blackwood's schemes as anyone else." The four men exchanged glances, and some kind of silent communication passed between them. Finally, the scarred gunman nodded. "Blackwood, you're under citizen's arrest for fraud and conspiracy," he announced, drawing his weapon again. "Boys, tie him up and throw him over a horse. We're taking a trip to see the federal marshal. You can't do this." Blackwood protested as rough hands grabbed him. "I'll have you all arrested. I have connections, influence." "You had influence," corrected the blue-eyed gunman as he bound the banker's hands. "Now you're just another criminal heading for prison." As the four men prepared to depart with their prisoner, the scarred gunman approached Samuel one last time. "Morrison, your father was a smart man, smarter than any of us gave him credit for." Samuel nodded, looking down at the documents that had saved his ranch and exposed a criminal conspiracy. "He always said that preparation was the key to survival in hard country. I never realized how thoroughly he'd prepared for this particular threat. You going to be all right here by yourself?" Samuel looked around at the land his family had worked for 4 generations, now secure once again thanks to his father's foresight and planning.
"I'll be fine."
This ranch has survived drought, disease, rustlers, and corrupt bankers. It'll take more than one crooked scheme to destroy what 4 generations of Morrisons have built. As the group rode away with Blackwood tied across a horse like a sack of grain, Samuel walked back toward his ranch house. The morning sun was climbing higher, and there was work to be done. Cattle needed tending, fences needed repair, and life on the Broken Arrow Ranch would continue as it had for nearly a century. But first, Samuel carefully rewrapped his father's documents and returned them to their hiding place in the old well. Future generations of Morrisons might need them someday, and Thomas Morrison's final gift to his family would remain safe, waiting to protect the ranch from whatever threats the future might bring. Standing on his porch once again, Samuel looked out over the vast expanse of his property with new appreciation for the man who had raised him. Thomas Morrison had been more than a rancher and a father. He had been a guardian, protecting his family's legacy through careful planning and meticulous preparation. The Broken Arrow Ranch was safe. Justice would be served, and the Morrison name would continue to be associated with this land for generations to come. Sometimes the best defense against evil was not violence or confrontation, but simply being smarter and more prepared than those who would do you harm. In the distance, Samuel could see his 3 Mexican cowboys riding toward the house, probably wondering what all the commotion had been about. He would tell them the story, and it would become